This is Mark Sobel. I'm the U.S. Chair of OMFIF. Today, I have the great delight and pleasure of being joined by Gian Maria Milesi-Ferretti. Gian Maria has been the Deputy Director of the IMF's Research Department for the past years, leading work on multilateral surveillance and the IMF's always much anticipated World Economic Outlook. Gian Maria is going to lead us off with a presentation on the recently issued WEO. I'll follow up with some questions. And Gian Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. I go quickly through the presentation so we can leave time for the Q&A. I will give you a flavor of our World Economic Outlook that was issued about a month ago, but also try to give you a flavor of how we see, the world having evolved since. And let me start by going to a slide that really summarizes what we have seen happening since we had issued our past WEO in June of this year. Fundamentally, the big contraction, the big recession, the big downturn that happened in the second quarter of this year for most economies in the world was truly unprecedented, but slightly less severe than we had expected in June. And we have seen signs that the pickup in economic activity in the third quarter was actually stronger and even stronger than what we had anticipated in our October WEO. The October WEO was issued on October 13th. We got basically the next week, we got the first data for the third quarter. It has been a bit better than we were expecting, even though the recovery is still a partial one. We had seen improvements across most advanced economies, still in a deep recession, but again, a pickup that was a bit stronger than we had anticipated. In the emerging world, instead, a lot of problems, particularly in some large ones. India have experienced an unprecedented contraction, and you will see that reflected in our forecast. The one really large exception to this dramatic contraction ensemble is China, where the economy has recovered quite a bit more rapidly. They experienced their severe recession in the first quarter, and the activity has picked up quite substantially since. And finally, two observations, a positive one and a negative one, of course. Financial markets have remained quite optimistic. This has been a godsend in terms of allowing financial conditions to be accommodative and restoring access to markets for a variety of emerging and developing economies, even though not for all of them. But unfortunately, and this is the one big change since we finalized the WEO, the caseloads of COVID infections have been rising worldwide, particularly strong in the neck of the woods where I am now. I'm in Italy, but in Europe more generally. We're really seeing a second wave, which is very, very strong in terms of number of infections. And that, of course, raises concerns about what is going to happen for the remainder of this year and early next year. Let me just mention that the policy response has been truly massive, particularly in advanced economies. I have a few charts here. You may just want to focus on the middle one in the interest of time, which gives you the announced fiscal measures that have been put in place by advanced economies, emerging economies, and so on. And you see, particularly for advanced economies, both genuine revenue and expenditure measures, as well as the so-called below the line measures, basically financing measures that make funds available to firms or financial institutions as needed. These measures have been truly massive. I would say this is clearly a lesson learned from the global financial crisis and the too timid fiscal response back then. But you also see these massive differences between countries with bigger gun power, like advanced economies, and low-income countries, where even in proportion to their economy, the interventions have been quite a bit more modest. I should stress that an extremely important component of the policy response has been massive monetary policy support that has really avoided a dramatic, collapse in financial market valuations, which had started in mid-March and was really, the panic was really laid to rest by concerted massive intervention by the main central banks, followed then by other countries that could ease as well. I will put briefly the slides on growth projections. I don't want to go into individual countries. Let me just give you the broad ballpark. Here we have growth rates in our forecast for 2020 and 2021, and as well as the revisions since our last forecast. And if you scroll, this is the slide on advanced economies, but it has the world growth forecast. You see a lot of very negative numbers in 2020, virtually across the board. A contraction of 4.4% for the world economy, 5.8% for advanced economies, and some differences across countries. A more severe recession in the euro area than in the US, even more severe in the UK. A lot of these numbers reflect really the severity of the hit from the pandemic, together with the extent of lockdown restrictions and extent and length of lockdown restrictions. But what I would like to stress is that for advanced economies as a whole, as you can see by comparing the growth rate in 2020 and 2021, we are not forecasting a recovery to the level of GDP that we had in 2019 until 2022. In other words, the contraction in 2020 is larger than the subsequent recovery in 2021. That is not true for the world economy, but it is true for advanced economy as a whole. For the next slide is on emerging and developing economies. And what you see there is that there is a recovery in 2021. You see it from the second set of numbers that is stronger than the contraction in 2020. Of course, emerging and developing economies have a higher trend growth than advanced economies. But if you exclude China from emerging and developing economies, and that's the third column you see there, you see that for emerging and developing economies, excluding China, you are not even recovering the level of output of 2019 by 2021. While if you focus on China, you see a relatively modest growth, but positive this year, and overall a growth rate over 2020 and 2021 of about 10%. So if I can summarize it in three sets of numbers, we see advanced economies shrinking over 2020 and 2021. We see emerging and developing economies, excluding China, shrinking over 2021, and China growing by about 10%. It is a pretty striking contraction, a pretty striking difference in outlook. And let me finally stress the extremely severe contraction in India. This is a country that has trend growth of about 7%, and trend growth of about 7%, and it is experiencing a contraction of about 10 this year. So a swing of 15, 16 percentage points. And let me move to the next slide. Of course, there is a lot of uncertainty concerning the outlook. And I have here a list of potential factors that can make the outlook turn out differently from what we are predicting. In particular, on the positive side, you could have more aggressive fiscal countermeasures, particularly if there are signs the economies are slowing. But I would say the most important one is the advance in therapies and the possibility of getting a vaccine produced and distributed at the needed scale. That's clearly the main upside. But of course, on the downside, we have a variety of risks. And given the situation, clearly the worsening of the pandemic is at the top of the list. But there are, of course, a number of other areas of concern. And I would say, let me just add one word on fiscal issues, just to say that the policy response is absolutely essential. But of course, one consequence of that, which you can see in these graphs, is that the level of government debt is rising very sharply. Not surprisingly, you have a lot of borrowing on the numerator side. You have a shrinking denominator because GDP is falling, so the debt to GDP ratio is rising. And while again, many advanced economies continue to access markets at very low rates, this is a different story for a number of low-income countries that really struggle, and there will be most likely, we've already had a number of cases of debt restructurings, and unfortunately, particularly if the pandemic persists, the list is likely to grow. And on the policy side, our really main points are to support healthcare systems, including funding for vaccines. I mean, again, vaccine nationalism is really dangerous. We really need vaccines to reach every country that is facing a difficult situation. We need to have financial support for countries that face severe constraints. And it is very important not to lift the pedal from the accelerator too soon in terms of policy support. It is really the time to keep the connective tissue of the economy alive, to ensure that the economies are able to recover once the pandemic wanes a bit, once restrictions are reduced. And of course, there is, on a longer term perspective, the importance of sort of migrating towards a more an economic structure that is green, that is more environmentally friendly, and a good time for public investment in these areas. I will leave it at this. I have a final slide here with medium-term challenges, but again, in the interest of time, I'm happy to come back to this during the discussion or take questions on these topics. And thank you very much for listening, and I apologize for the background. But again, I have kids in school and virtual schooling at this time, and doing this from quite close to me in this room. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Well, Gian Maria, you've focused on chapter 1 of the WEO. There are other chapters, of course. I thought just for the sake of fleshing out this presentation, you could just give us a brief insight into what the other chapters and themes were.
Absolutely, thank you, Mark. So we had two what we call analytical chapters. One was focused on the impact of lockdowns on economic activity, and trying to assess whether, to the extent possible, what the impact was on activity, what the impact was on infections, but also whether it was more lockdowns affecting activity, or it was more social distancing. So, the choice of people to stay away from each other, to take measures to avoid the risk of infection. And the chapter finds that both are at play, but both set of, both the formal measures, of course, and social distancing did make a very significant difference in terms of infections, and considering the stress under which health systems were, the short-term economic cost was really something that was, a cost that was needed to ensure that economies would be able to um, contain the health pressures. Of course, a lot of lessons learned since, including on improved treatment for patients, and we have seen it with the second wave, where the mortality, which unfortunately remains quite noticeable, has come down a bit compared to the earlier wave. The second chapter, in contrast, which had a much longer time span, it was looking at a green recovery and how to hit the commitments to keep temperature increases, below the 2.5%, the 2.5 degrees, uh, uh, and so by 2050, and what type of policy package would be needed to achieve those goals, net zero emissions and the like. And the policy packages, both in terms of green infrastructure investment, as well as in a gradual increase in carbon tax. So really, one very focused on short-run issues, one very focused on medium-term issues.
Great. Well, let's turn to some of the policy issues. You and I have both heard that the IMF stands for it's mostly fiscal. For advanced economies such as the US, it seems as if there's a huge demand for safe assets, um, but debt to GDP ratios, as you showed, are soaring. So the US debt held by the public is now around 100% of GDP, and I think you and I would have viewed that with alarm years ago. But interest rates are zero. We say that there needs to be more fiscal support now. It's not the time for fiscal consolidation. We hear analysts talking about R minus G being negative and debt service costs being very low because we're at the zero lower bound. So how does the IMF see this nexus of issues, and should we be more relaxed about debt GDP ratios given safe asset demand and low debt service costs? And how much consolidation do you think we'll need to pivot back to consolidation after the virus?
I think that this is like really fundamental questions on which that we've all been trying to grapple with, and we have the set of answers we have is clearly dependent on the type of country and each individual situation. Clearly, one can say that countries need to act very aggressively, but in order for countries to act very aggressively on the fiscal front, they need to have market access at reasonable rates, and that's clearly the case for issuers of reserve currencies, the US, but others, but is less so, of course, for countries that face a much steeper curve, supply curve of funding. I would say that ensuring that the economy is able to restart on a strong footing is extremely important, and considering a number of mandated restrictions that have been implied by shifts in behavior of individuals, it was extremely important to ensure that firms could be kept alive when they had to temporarily halt activity or reduce activity. And it was extremely important to protect the worker-firm relations as well. I would also add, in terms of priorities, that this has been an incredibly regressive crisis, hitting sectors that employ a much larger share of population than the share of GDP they represent, and that tend to employ the young, tend to employ women, tend to employ a lot of people with, on average, somewhat lower skill levels, and people that can really have they can really have very thin safety nets. And it was extremely important from just a social, social contract perspective to ensure that these people are protected from the severity of the downturn. Now, budget constraints do not stop operating, of course, and there is an issue about medium-term, a return to medium-term debt, a debt path that is sustainable over the medium term. So there is no question that that is going to come, and it will imply, prioritization on the spending side, as well as we see, the need to raise revenues in a progressive way. It's hard to see how one can avoid that, considering a lot of the spending pressures that we're going to see, including on infrastructure, including on promoting a green recovery. So yes, we don't think budget constraints are gone, but we think in terms of timing, now it is important to fight the recession, while again keeping the MD says, keep the receipts, our managing director. I would say, along similar lines, be careful about, permanent increases in spending. And so, act on emergencies, act on what is needed to support the recovery, but consider the intertemporal budget constraint. Beware of permanent increases in government spending, unless again it is on things like infrastructure or green recovery, which have a number of benefits that come with them.
Well, great. So there's been a bit of a debate, transatlantic debate about the extension of support. In the United States, we've relied on unemployment assistance. In Germany and elsewhere, some have used the Kurzarbeit approach, where you compensate workers for lost hours in a job. And there's a debate about which is preferable. Some say the German approach keeps workers trapped in firms and impedes adjustment, but that the US approach is far more disruptive and causes higher unemployment. What's your view?
Ken, very good question, and one to which is difficult to give a straight two-line answer. I would say that a lot of the differences in responses are related also to differences in the in the nature of labor contracts and the more generally how the social policies react to these types of shocks on the two sides of the Atlantic. There are clearly costs and benefits. There are benefits to keeping, again, ties between workers and firms. There are costs in terms of preventing or hindering to some extent labor force reallocation across sectors. I think in practice these are very difficult calls to make. We know structural change is important, but for policymakers, we're facing a truly unprecedented crisis with a lot of uncertainty about duration. So clearly, the more persistent the effects of the pandemic are, the more a system like Kurzarbeit or furloughs may end up slowing labor force reallocation. But as a short run, given the type of safety net existing in the short run, that was probably that was an important component of the policy response in Europe, considering the system in place. But I think it is important for European governments to be very aware of this trade-off and the importance of ensuring that we, again, we protect who we need to protect, but we don't freeze layoffs and bankruptcies for a very long time in a way that will de facto hinder the creation of the creation of employment. So I think it is a real danger in Europe. And on the other side of on the US side, it is a real danger if we leave these additional benefits, from an unemployment system that is typically not overly generous. If we let, these protections expire I mean, the impact on income distribution, and not just on income distribution, but potentially on skills, on labor force attachments, on many other things, could be quite dramatic. So I think both approaches have pros and cons. We need to be very wary of the extreme consequences on both sides.
Great. Turning to monetary policy, central banks still have ammunition, as they always say, but monetary policy also loses effectiveness around the zero lower bound. And then others say, though, that fiscal monetary coordination, if inflation doesn't surge and central bank independence is retained, could be potent and should be undertaken. How does the fund feel about that nexus of issues?
So we think that, clearly acting monetary and fiscal policy have acted together and have been particularly effective because of that. Now you need to, again, it is true that inflation is clearly not at the moment the most pressing concern, to put it mildly, in a lot of a big share of the world economies. But we need to be always cognizant of the fact that central bank independence is extremely important, and it's really the pillar on which this credibility of monetary policy hinges. And we know from the few countries where that credibility has been jeopardized what the potential consequences are. So I think acting together when you have a big downturn of this type, it is clearly important to have a potent response that relies on both. But monetary policy can do so much. It cannot, deal with income distribution issues. It can support risk taking, but it cannot help workers, or particular sectors. It cannot help small. It's actually easier for monetary policy to help larger firms, say through corporate bond purchases, than it is to help the small and medium enterprises. Of course, credit programs for those have been put in place, but they have to go through banks. It's a more complex chain of transmission. And clearly there is a lot of scope for government policies on the fiscal side to buttress actions on the monetary policy side. But I think both are clearly needed, considering the scale of the policy response. Of the scale of the challenge requires a very, very aggressive policy response. And in emerging economies, one big concern about having actions similar to those in advanced economies, say purchase of assets by central banks, government debt by central bank, was the impact on monetary policy credibility. A number of emerging economies were able to do that without seeing a sharp weakening of their currencies. This is a good sign of, perceived institutional strength of these countries. But we also have to keep in mind that markets have been very optimistic, and we cannot count on this being always the case, particularly if we see the pandemic sticking around for longer than we all hope it will.
Well, that's great. Let me just ask one more question, and then we'll move on to discussion with the audience. It's more of a medium, longer term issue for this decade as a whole. I've been a bit dreary, shall I say, about my outlook for the 2020s. Potential growth is very low. Japan, it's near zero. Europe, it's under 1 or 1-ish, let's say. The US is coming under 2. I think China is going to slow down. Most analysts do, due to demographics and a handoff from investment to consumption, which could bring sustainable growth rate down to 4%. I've seen, according to some IMF research, if not lower. And now we have this pandemic, which is going to produce scarring and may further reduce potential. You mentioned in your opening presentation that perhaps infrastructure and greening could provide a bit of a boost. But on the whole, do you share this view? And does the fund that potential is going to be on a downward path in this decade, and that perhaps will make conditions a bit more difficult?
This is the first one since the start of the pandemic where we are sticking our necks out with a 5-year 5 years out projection, and we've done that, but again with a strong sense that uncertainty is extreme, really, and the danger that you highlight is clearly a very present one. That is that you compound uh, if you want, pre-COVID weak productivity dynamics, and of course you have slower labor force growth, if not labor force contractions, in advanced economies and in many emerging economies in particular, and compound that with all the negative consequences that from the scarring and the like, that or that crisis, or that this crisis can engender. So what we can say is clearly you have to redouble efforts to improve productivity performance. I would say uncertainty is still very high because we just don't know how this move to more remote work, a big push to digitalization, how all these factors are going to affect total factor productivity. For now, we fear that you're seeing the costs of the pandemic in terms of all the measures to ensure workers' health that are clearly taking a toll on productivity. Um, uh, they make every service activity, they make medical care enormously more complicated than it used to be. So the risk is clearly there that we will see a period of mediocre productivity growth. And again, this makes it all the more important to have a policy mix that is the most sensible and the most productivity friendly. Uh, uh, I would say on the hopeful side, if I compare to the global financial crisis, the policy response has been more aggressive, considerably more aggressive, and while it is contact intensive sectors have been slaughtered by this crisis, I think we have to keep in mind that if science comes to the rescue, if we manage to have a situation where people can go back congregating as we all love to, demand for these services will remain strong. There was a shift towards more demand for these services. So it is a different set of problems in different sectors, but I don't think this is this may affect maybe some types of business travel on a more stable basis, but I don't think that if the health issues are eventually addressed, that this is going to keep people from returning to restaurants, from returning to travel. So I have some hope. I mean, not just personally. I mean, I think we hope the economy can come back. But again, uncertainty is very high, and clearly we could see pretty weak growth in the years ahead.
Well, Gian Maria Milesi-Ferretti, thank you for engaging in such a good discussion with us today. I thank you tremendously.
Thank you.